Hey there everybody, this is Ray and we will be continuing our video series on White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. In this video series we will be tackling the best-selling book being used to evangelize our society with a pagan religion. We will go chapter by chapter breaking down its arguments and refuting them. And this edition, we will be tackling Chapter 3, Racism After the Civil Rights Movement. So without further ado, let's get it started. The author begins with a series of quotes, and these quotes are quotes that I guess she hears white people say that are supposed to absolve them from racism or be an explanation for why they're not racist. Robin DiAngelo is not very charitable in this regard. She doesn't believe that these are valid excuses or valid experiences for that matter. Next, she goes on to celebrate progress that has been made, and she celebrates the federal recognition of homosexual marriage. She views this as a milestone, significant and worthy of celebration. She also views the election of Barack Obama as significant and worthy of celebration. Now, this is an extremely partisan book, and I don't think she realizes that people like me will read it, although ironically, of course. And she's also celebrating sin. So keep that in mind, especially as certain Christian institutions that I have witnessed are pushing this book. So next she kind of goes on a section about colorblind racism, where we see people as individuals, not as black or white. She wants to tackle the I have a dream speech. One line in King's speech in particular, that one day he might be judged by the content of his character, not the color of his skin, was seized upon by the white public because the words were seen to provide a simple and immediate solution to racial tensions. Pretend that we don't see race and racism will end. So she takes great issue with that line in King's speech, that we actually judge people as individuals, not as black or white. She, as a postmodernist Marxist, is incapable of doing that because critical race theory will not allow that. But, a more pithy and fun way to say this is that Martin Luther King Jr.'s words uphold racism. So she continues her rant, pretending that she did not notice that he was black was not helpful to him in any way, as it denied his reality. Indeed, it refused his reality. So she kind of uses some anecdote where I guess a white person got into a back and forth with her token black trainer. And this is, again, upholds a very postmodern view of the world, that, we see everything by our experiences determine reality. So you see here, it refused his reality. As a Christian, I believe that reality is objective, not personal. As a postmodernist, she would disagree. That is why we hear statements like speak your truth rather than speak the truth. It's postmodernism. We might think of conscious racial awareness. This is a new term for us, racial awareness. And it's actually kind of a more Gnostic term to suggest that certain people can have racial awareness and other people can't. And these factors are based off a special knowledge provided to you by your experience, not anything that can be objectively studied. Moving on. So here we get adversive racism is a manifestation of racism that is well-intentioned people who see themselves as educated and progressive are more likely to exhibit. So here she's trying to accuse white people of being racist or exhibiting racism, which to me is synonymous. So whites enact racism while maintaining a positive self-image in many ways. So according to her, white people should not be maintaining a positive self-image, and when it comes to race, that is. And a few of her lines for this are avoiding direct racial language and using racially coded terms such as urban, underprivileged, diverse, sketchy, and good neighborhoods. Now these are, I guess, what the woke crowd would call microaggressions. She doesn't use this word very often in the book. So white people are using microaggressions. Attributing inequality between whites and people of color to causes other than racism. So if you see disparities as being something other than being caused by racism, you are enacting racism in order to maintain a positive self-image, and therefore you are wrong. So this is where we start to see one of the major criticisms of this book. Her argument is non-falsifiable, and this is a logical fallacy. Allow me to explain. In the scientific method, which according to the Smithsonian Blackness Museum or whatever says is a white thing, in the scientific method, we design experiments that test a hypothesis, right? So her argument is like a hypothesis. The hypothesis is white fragility. And this is where we start to see the non-falsifiability of her argument. In the scientific method, if your experiment does not have the ability to test whether the hypothesis is false, the experiment is invalid because it's not falsifiable. In other words, a science experiment needs to be able to prove the hypothesis false. It needs to actually test the hypothesis. Her argument cannot be tested, because if you disagree with her argument, you are exhibiting white fragility, and therefore she wins. That's her argument. It's heads I win, tails you lose. And we're starting to see that right here as a means to accuse white people of enacting racism. So if you disagree, if you wanted to assert that inequality may have other causes than racism, you're enacting racism. That's her argument here. It's non-falsifiable. So we move on to the next page. Racial bonding, a new word for us. And then racial danger. Oh, okay. This is actually a pretty interesting anecdote she uses here, where a couple that she's talking to moves to New Orleans and says that they got a great deal on a house, and the author automatically assumes that the house was in a black neighborhood. It was apparently $25,000, and they also had to buy a gun. And I guess, these are the people she hangs out with. I immediately knew that they had bought a home in a black neighborhood. This was a moment of racial bonding between a couple of white people who shared this story of racial danger. So this is where we shift. The chapter goes from trying to retcon history and the definition of racism to talking about neighborhoods and crime. Rather, the story's emotional power rests on why a house would be cheap because it is in a black neighborhood where whites might literally not get out alive. Again, this is where she assumes that the house was cheap because it was in a black neighborhood, not because it was in a crime-filled neighborhood. She goes on about this anecdote. White people will perceive danger simply by the presence of black people. We cannot trust our perceptions when it comes to race and crime. No, but we can trust actual data. Like uniform crime reports or reporting. So crime rates. We can trust that. But according to her argument here, white people can't exactly see that. We can't objectively look at a neighborhood and determine whether it has a lot of crime in it based off crime, because we will always do it according to race. Now, I actually know white neighborhoods that I wouldn't want to live in because of crime. But again, I only see race. Now there are black neighborhoods I wouldn't live in because of crime. But where I live, in the area where I live, there are actually black middle-class neighborhoods. But, in Maryland, finding cheap rent is pretty difficult unless you're willing to live in a crime-filled neighborhood like West Baltimore. But, and it's not because I'm white that I wouldn't risk putting me and my wife through that. It's because I have common sense. It's because I actually care about my family and want to protect them. She would see that as being racist. But regardless of whether a neighborhood is actually more or less dangerous than other neighborhoods, what is salient about this exchange is how it functions racially and what that means for white people, for the white people that engaged in it. So she's kind of calling this a moment of white people bonding over being white and believing themselves to be better. She calls this casual race talk. Casual race talk is the key component of white racial framing. Like I said, this would be the actual racial framing, or racial frames would be the most commonly used new word she uses in this book. And it accomplishes the goals of elevating white people while demeaning people of color. Race talk always implies a racial us and them. And again, we're back to racial coding. New word for us. And then racially innocent, which I guess means like sheltered racially. Again, new terms for us that we non-woke people did not learn. So here we go on about Trayvon Martin's experience in a white gated neighborhood because it reverses the actual direction of the danger. So in other words, black people in white neighborhoods are more in danger than white people in black neighborhoods, I guess is what she's trying to say. So now we're kind of wrapping up the chapter here. We might consider these whites actually more aware and honest about their biases than those who consider ourselves open-minded, yet who have rarely thought critically about the biases we inevitably hold or how we are expressing them. Okay, so she's talking about actual white supremacists here. So she says that white supremacists are more racially aware, to use her terminology. White supremacists are more racially aware than white people who don't care about race. That is the argument she is making here. So I guess this ties back to the fact that white supremacists and woke leftists have far more in common with each other than, just white people who don't care about race and woke white people. Okay, so now we're getting a little bit more partisan. She goes on about how America's not in a post-racial era, and she credits Donald Trump for making this obvious. Now, I would see that racial tensions, if we want to acknowledge that as a term, had risen before the election of Donald Trump. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, events like that happened during the Barack Obama era. So, yeah, here she goes on to go more in detail about what other sociologists or critical race theorists are talking about. This kind of becomes a argumentative circle jerk. Further, they found that whites involved in these incidents most often played predictable roles. Typically, there was a protagonist who initiates the racist act, a cheerleader who encourages it through the laughter or agreement, and spectators who stood in silence, and rarely a dissenter who objected. So she's talking about white people telling jokes. You'll see, if we haven't already, that she does not really have a sense of humor when it comes to race. And I wonder how she views Dave Chappelle's comedy, for instance, or like a Chris Rock. Virtually all dissenters were subject to a form of peer pressure in which they were told it was only a joke and that they should lighten up. Again, I think that's fair. Okay, so I guess now she's saying behaviors that white people exhibit around or about black people. Acting overly nice is apparently bad. Avoiding contact, crossing the street, not going into a particular bar or club. Mimicking, so I guess doing impressions is now racist. Being careful not to use racial terms or labels, so avoiding racial language is apparently bad. Using code words, racial coding, to talk negatively about people of color. Occasional violence, okay, actual violence. So, I guess she ends with saying, I'm often asked if I think the younger generation is less racist. No, I don't. In some ways, racism's adaptations over time are more sinister than concrete rules such as Jim Crow. The adaptations produce the same outcome. People of color are blocked from moving forward, but have been put in place by a dominant white society that won't or can't admit it to its own beliefs. So she's saying that people have not gotten less racist over time. In fact, in some ways, she suggests that white people are more racist now, or the younger generation even is more racist now than in previous generations. This is a very interesting claim she's making. And I don't believe that this is the chapter where she kind of... Oh yes, here's the data. Perhaps most significantly, 41% of white millennials believe that the government pays too much attention to minorities. So I guess policies like affirmative action and welfare, stuff like that. And 48% believe that discrimination against whites is as big of a problem as discrimination against people of color. So I guess, this could be taken two ways, that these white people believe that discrimination, regardless of the direction, is equal. and no form of discrimination is worse than another on the basis of race. So that could explain that number. If anything, that actually means that these people are less racist. But again, that's not the conclusion she draws. In her conclusion, Robin DiAngelo states that this data suggests that the younger generation is not less racist than the previous generation that lived with Jim Crow. So that takes us to the end of chapter 3, where Robin DiAngelo tries to create racism as a much bigger problem than it actually is in our society. And she wants to argue that this is a third wave of racism that is equivocable to the Jim Crow era and slavery. And I would disagree with that. I think that's a really bad argument that's not backed by history or data. She is creating a non-falsifiable argument about what is racist and what is not. She's also kind of interchangeably using the word racist to mean what normal people believe it is. Just to pull up the definition here. A person who shows or feels discrimination or prejudice against people of other races. So she's kind of interchangeably using the normal definition of racist with her definition of racist. And it only gets worse from here. It's not going to get better. But we're going to have fun with it. I'm Ray, and this is the Evangelical Dark Web doing a rebuttal series on White Fragility. Like and subscribe, and comment below what you think. And I'll catch you on the next one.